Hello everyone. I am Jamie Holton. I'm a second year BA photography student here at PCA, and I suppose similarly to Carolyn, I was reasonably bright when I was in primary school, and I was always really interested in science. When everyone else was reading fiction books about, Alice in Wonderland, I was always reading about space and big ships and how cars worked and that sort of thing. So, and I was also, like Carolyn, very, very bad at drawing. So I decided that I was probably going to be a scientist, or I definitely wasn't going to be an artist. But as I sort of grew up, I got interested in photography, and it kind of struck me as really cool because it is a science and an art. So it is an art because it's a creative medium, but it's also a science because there are so many things that you can touch on. So in the digital world, for instance, you can touch on megapixels, how sensors work, how they actually pick up, and how they determine the amount of light in a scene. In the film world, you can talk about all kinds of things. You can talk about the emulsion that's on the film, and how the light actually reacts with that emulsion. And so I loved it because it allowed me to have free reign and create something that was mine and sort of send a message, but also it ticked that sciencey box. I could get home and read about it for hours at a time and get better at it, So I'm really intrigued by sort of the history of photography, and I work a lot with alternative and traditional processes like film. Currently, as Carolyn said, I'm currently doing a project on cyanotypes, and I'm also currently writing an essay on the evolution of the cyanotype from a science to a fine art. So I guess you could say I've been reading too much about this stuff recently. So this talk is about photography in the space age, but we sort of have to start at the beginning. And it's difficult to start at the beginning because photography actually, the discovery of photography is sort of based on two ideas. The first is the discovery and the understanding that some things can be changed by light. So in sort of the 13th and 14th century, really, they started discovering that stuff like silver, it changes colour when it's exposed to the light. In the 1840s, they discovered that iron salts can change colour when they're exposed to the light. And the other aspect of it was the discovery, or I suppose the invention of the camera obscura, which is basically like a box or a room, and then you'll have kind of an aperture, and the light will come through and it will create an image. But the image doesn't stay. So they knew that they could create an image, but they didn't know how to make it stay, and they knew that they could make things change based on light. So it kind of made sense that the two things could be merged to create photography, as it was called. So this is the oldest surviving photograph that we currently know of. Obviously, there could well actually be others out there, but this is the oldest one that we know of. And this was taken by a guy called Niepce, I think I'm saying that right. And he took this in about 1826 to 1827, and it's called The View from the Window at Le Crac, which was his estate in Bordeaux at the time. And so he created this basically. He used, this is what the actual image looks like. It's basically a plate of something called pewter, which is basically tin and lead put together just to create basically a metal sheet. On top of that, he placed something called bitumen, which was also called Syrian asphalt sometimes. And basically that's just a compound which hardens when it's exposed to light. And so he was thinking about this and he thought that could be useful. And so he put it basically in a camera obscura. And then after about 4 days, it took about 4 days for it to be exposed, he cleaned the plate with lavender oil, which cleaned off the unhardened bitumen. And so he was left with only the hardened bitumen, which is the highlights here, the whites that you can see. And in the shadows where it hadn't hardened, it was all just washed away, and he was left with an image. Funnily enough, he was quite secretive about it. Unlike the other two or three main photographic inventors, they were all blasé, and they wanted everyone to know about their brilliant new invention. Niepce was really secretive. He didn't really trust anyone. He went to meet with one of his friends in England after he took this image, and he showed it to his friend, and his friend said, this is amazing, basically, you need to take this to the Royal Society and tell them all about it. And so Niepce did, but he wouldn't really tell the Royal Society how he did it. And so they basically rejected his idea because he refused to tell them how he actually did it. And so this image was actually lost for quite a long time, until about 1900 or so, when it was found again and it was exhibited all over the world, basically, as the oldest photograph in existence. After that, funnily enough, it was lost again until it was found in about 1950. This guy bought it and he took it to Kodak and he asked Kodak to scan it electronically, which is what this image is. And they did this and they apparently found it extremely difficult, quite understandably, because you can't really shine anything through it, which is how you traditionally scan something. And they also actually, it would appear that either Kodak or somebody else around this time frame actually damaged it, which is what these 3 points are, which is pretty unlucky, actually. I wouldn't like to be responsible for that. So, moving on to the space race, really. This is the first photograph that was ever taken of the Earth from space. It was taken by the US Army, actually. And what they basically did was it's quite funny, really. They literally strapped a camera and a load of film to an old German V-2 rocket, which was what the Germans tried to use to shoot at London in the Second World War. The US Army took one of these rockets, strapped a camera to it, shot it into space, and then when it fell back to Earth, they just drove up, collected the film, exposed it, or developed it rather, and they managed to get one of these images. And I found this really funny quote, which is quite interesting. And so this guy, Fred Rulli, he was a 19-year-old enlisted man assigned to the recovery team that actually drove in and got the film. And he said, when the scientists found the cassette in good shape, they were ecstatic. They were jumping up and down like kids. And later, back at the launch site, when they first projected the photos onto the screen, the scientists just went nuts. Which I think is really cool. You can imagine all these old guys in white coats just going mental. And I mean, why wouldn't you, really? You know, there's 120 years between these two images, which is crazy. You've got to think about the steps that had to be taken in space exploration and the steps that had to be taken in the photographic sense. So that's pretty crazy. And then obviously we move on to one of the next biggest moments in the early space race. That's the Apollo 11 mission, where Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. And they took these two pictures among literally thousands of others, which are all online and free to view, by the way. And I found these really interesting because they were scientists, they were astronauts, they were paid massive amounts by NASA to fly 4 days through the dead of space, land on the moon at great risk of life, and they just, I guess they kind of just wanted to commemorate the moment, you know? They were there on this scientific mission, but at the end of the day, they just really wanted to, I suppose you'd take a selfie nowadays, wouldn't you? But this picture especially is really, you know, it's quite popular and quite amazing. I suppose Buzz was probably the better photographer. But just the emotion that you can see in, you know, Neil's face is really brilliant. And I suppose this is really what we do with photography a lot of the time nowadays as well. We're just trying to capture a moment, capture the emotion in a scene. These two guys millions of miles away from home, which is really cool. Yeah, and so after Apollo, everyone was going nuts about space, basically. They had, you know, they obviously had the Apollo missions, and then they moved on. They were saying all this crazy stuff, like they wanted to have a base on the moon, and they wanted to have basically an international space station, except they wanted to have it by the end of the 60s, by the end of the 70s, that sort of thing. What they sort of settled on was the Hubble Telescope, and this was based on an idea from, actually the guy was named Hubble, obviously, and he basically theorized back in the 1920s, if I remember correctly, that any telescope that was land-based would basically never be as good as anything that was sent into space. And this is obviously because of the atmosphere, which blocks light. When you if you sort of look at a city at night and you see all of the lights twinkle, that's actually because the heat is rising from the ground and it's warping the light. And so the same thing happens when you're trying to take pictures of stars from beneath the atmosphere, except obviously it's a lot more inconvenient. And so the Hubble Telescope, it was launched in 1990 and it cost them about $10 billion. It has cost $10 billion by 2010. And the crazy thing about the Hubble Telescope is that when it was launched, it was actually found to be faulty. So basically, when they ground the lens, which at the time was the most precisely created object ever, basically, they had a little protector on the drill bit that would grind the lens, and they forgot to take it off. So the lens was like the tiniest amount out, but it was terrible. You know, the stars were really quite blurry. Which is pretty horrendous, really. I mean, if you think about going and getting home with your brand new Nikon and it doesn't work, and you think, that sucks. I mean, they spent $10 billion on this. They created the space shuttle so that they could launch it and service it. A lot of money was spent on that as well, and a lot of lives were spent on the space shuttle. And they got it into space, 400 kilometers above the Earth, and found that it didn't work, which was pretty awkward. So they sent a shuttle up again in '93 and they fixed it, and now it's all cool. But the Hubble is coming to the end of its life, but we'll get onto that. And so possibly one of the most famous images that Hubble has taken and continues to take is this deep field, is what they call them. And this is basically, back in '95, they had like 10 days. Obviously, time on the Hubble telescope is extremely expensive and extremely hard to come by. You have to have something really good. You have to actually write basically a proposal. You want to say, this is where I want to point the Hubble, this is why I want to point it here, et cetera, et cetera. They had about 10 days where the Hubble was free, basically, over Christmas in '94. And they decided, basically just for fun, to point the Hubble at the darkest point in space. So when you look there from basically a land-based telescope, you can't see anything. When you look there with your eyes, it just looks like absolute pitch black. So what they did was they pointed the Hubble at this point for 10 consecutive days. They took 342 images, which was an overall exposure time of about 100 hours. And they managed to actually pick out this is the original Hubble Deep Field. And it was really famous because it, actually every single speck is not a star, it's a galaxy. And each of these galaxies probably has thousands, millions of stars in it. And so it's really interesting to see the actual vastness of space. On the right here is one of the more recent deep fields. This is the ultraviolet coverage of the ultra deep field. And that was actually, that was over 2,000 exposures that were taken over the course of 12 years, which is crazy. And I thought this was interesting because it's sort of, in a way, it's sort of similar to actually what we do with our art. We, look for things where they aren't. Searching for things in the darkness, literally in this case. So when it comes on to basically the end of the Hubble's life, which is expected to be in the mid-20s, I believe, they've devised this new extra nice telescope called the James Webb Telescope. And this is actually, I believe they've been working on this since the mid-90s. The mirror is going to be about 3 times the size of Hubble, so it's going to be able to pick up a lot more light, basically. It's more based on infrared light, the James Webb Telescope is. The Hubble is more ultraviolet and a bit of infrared. But as part of the Hubble missions, they actually found that it was really useful to see infrared light, and so the James Webb is focused on infrared light. And one of the reasons why it's been so delayed is, one, currently we don't really have a space launch system, although I think it is going to be launched by the European Space Agency. Secondly, it's not actually going to orbit the Earth. It's going to sort of orbit a mixture of the Sun and the Earth. It's going to orbit something called a Lagrange point, which is basically if you imagine you've got the sun and the Earth orbiting it in a circle, and the Earth is here, the James Webb will be about here, and I think it'll be about 4 million kilometers away from the Earth. And so it's going to take a lot of manpower and a lot of money to get it out there. But it's going to be able to take much higher res images, and it's going to be able to see much further than even Hubble did.
When's that going to be launched?
How long's a piece of string? NASA is famously optimistic about these sorts of things. You know, they devised Hubble in '79, and they said it would be launched in '83, and it didn't get launched until 1990, and it was broken. They said this was going to get launched in the mid-2000s, I believe, but I think they're hoping for 21, but not certain on that. But that wraps up my presentation, and as you can tell, I quite like space. I actually named my dog Laika, so I thought I'd sort of dedicate the presentation to my little puppy, named after the first dog to ever orbit the Earth. So yeah, that's me.
Okey-dokey. So I know